At my own brother's awards ceremony, security stopped me. "Ma'am, you're not on the list." I wasn't just standing at a gate, I was standing at the intersection of middle age and invisibility, where the sacrifices of a lifetime often go unnoticed, and where family can be the deepest source of pain. My brother Ethan smirked at his wife. "My sister is just a useless desk jockey. She should have married a real officer." He had no idea my so-called desk job was about to save his life and shatter his pride on the very same day. My name is Sophia Hayes. I am 34 years old, and on this brilliant May morning, the weight of years spent being unseen pressed against my chest like a familiar ache. The very air I breathed felt like a prelude to betrayal, a betrayal I had known far too well in my years as a forgotten daughter, a dismissed sister, a woman navigating the sharp edges of family expectations in the quiet loneliness of adulthood. As I drove my car over the majestic arch of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, the salty wind carried the sting of memories that never fully healed. The sun glinted off the water, far too cheerful for the storm that awaited me. Ahead lay the hallowed grounds of the United States Naval Academy, a place that had always felt like his kingdom, not mine. The stoic red brick walls whispered of discipline, honor, and a legacy that I was born into but never allowed to fully claim. At my own brother's awards ceremony, I was told I wasn't on the list. "Ma'am, you're not on the list for Lieutenant Ethan Hayes." The words stung, not just because I was being turned away at the gate, but because they were a painful echo of a truth I had carried for years, a truth familiar to many in their mid-30s and 40s, that somewhere along the path, we can become invisible to the people who should know us best. I wasn't a stranger. I was his sister. But standing there, I realized that in my family's story, I had always been an afterthought. My name is Sophia Hayes. I am 34 years old. This was supposed to be just another carefully played performance, the supportive older sister attending her brother's big moment. I knew my part by heart. For years, I had been the background character in the grand narrative of the Hayes family, a silent cheerleader, a side note, a quiet shadow standing just out of the spotlight. I had learned to accept it, to wear it like a second skin. But that morning, as I crossed the majestic Chesapeake Bay Bridge, the familiar salt air didn't soothe me. It bit at my skin, sharp and cold, a reminder of how many times I'd driven to family events with a hollow ache in my chest. The sun danced cheerfully across the water, but the brightness only served to highlight the weight I carried, a lifetime of being quietly dismissed, overlooked, and excluded. Ahead lay the hallowed grounds of the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, a place where tradition and pride are etched into every red brick, every perfectly trimmed lawn. It was a kingdom built on discipline, hierarchy, and a very specific kind of masculine glory. Ethan belonged there. His story fit seamlessly within those walls. Mine, they had decided long ago, did not. I found a parking space and sat in the car for a long moment, watching the families. Proud parents with cameras around their necks, spouses in elegant dresses, children bouncing with excitement. Midshipmen in crisp white uniforms stood like monuments to legacy and service. These were the families who had front row seats to the story, the ones who were celebrated. And I was just attending. I adjusted my beige trench coat, deliberately chosen to hide the uniform beneath it. It wasn't about deception, it was about survival. I had learned long ago that my family only saw what they wanted to see. I would let them. For now. At the main checkpoint, a young petty officer scanned my ID and checked his tablet. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. You're not on the guest list." His professionalism was perfect, but his confusion was real. He turned the screen toward me as proof. My name wasn't there. My parents were listed. Ethan's wife was listed. But me? I wasn't even a clerical oversight. I had been deliberately erased. As if summoned by the sting of that realization, the familiar black SUV my family favored pulled up. Ethan stepped out, the conquering hero, his uniform immaculate, his tan skin glowing. He saw me. He saw the guard. And he smirked, a smirk I knew too well. He leaned toward his wife and said, just loudly enough for me to hear, probably a paperwork mix-up. She should have married a real officer instead of playing with spreadsheets. The cruelty was sharp, but what broke me wasn't his words, it was my parents' silence. My mother suddenly became fascinated with the clasp of her pearl brooch. My father scowled, annoyed not at Ethan's insult, but at the minor inconvenience of this public scene. They didn't stop. They didn't vouch for me. They walked past, as if I were nothing more than a forgotten bag they'd left behind at the airport. The young petty officer looked mortified. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside." And I did. I didn't argue. I didn't fight. I simply stood there, watching my family walk away, leaving me stranded outside a place that had always felt close to me. At that moment, the weight of decades pressed down on me. I had always thought there might come a day when they would see me, when they would understand. But as I stood at the gate, the truth crystallized, they never would. Not unless I made them. Let them believe it, I thought. Let them believe I was nothing more than a woman with a desk job. Today, I would show them exactly how wrong they were. As the guard returned to his post, I allowed the memories to rise. Memories I had locked away, thinking I had outgrown the pain. I remembered the day Ethan's acceptance letter arrived. Our backyard became the stage for a grand celebration, a barbecue that seemed to host every retired officer in the Tri-County area. My father, usually so cold and distant, beamed with pride, introducing Ethan as the heir to the Hayes legacy. My mother brought out a sheet cake with "Congratulations, future Admiral" in bright blue frosting. It was a coronation. That very same week, I had won a national science fair for my cryptographic algorithm. I approached my father with the medal, my heart pounding, hoping, just this once, that he might be proud. He barely glanced at it, murmured "Good job, sweetie," and turned the conversation back to Ethan's training regimen. My medal went into a wooden box with forgotten childhood trinkets, a silent symbol of my place in the family. Years later, when I told them I had been accepted into naval intelligence, my father's disapproval was so sharp I can still feel it. "Support role," he sneered. "The Hayes family doesn't do support." And so I became the desk jockey in their story, the forgettable daughter, the woman on the sidelines. They never asked what I actually did. They never knew the lives I helped save, the missions I directed, the crises I quietly diffused. They never knew that I had already saved Ethan's life once, without him ever realizing it. I had spent years thinking I needed their approval. Maybe, if I worked hard enough, if I was patient enough, they would see me. But as I stood at the gate, my name missing from the list, I realized something even more painful, and more liberating. I no longer needed their permission to exist. I didn't need their validation. What I needed was to show them the truth. Not with words. Not with arguments. But with undeniable, inescapable proof. And today, they would finally see me. Today, I would not be their footnote. Today, I would be impossible to ignore. Growing up in the Hayes family wasn't a childhood, it was an audition. From my earliest memories, it was clear there was only one script, and my brother Ethan had landed the leading role before he could even tie his shoes. He was the chosen one, the golden boy, the future of the Hayes legacy. I was just the extra. When we were kids, my father's love was a rare currency, doled out in nods of approval that seemed to fall effortlessly on Ethan. My father's expectations weren't just high. They were Everest. And while I climbed, desperate to be seen, Ethan soared, collecting accolades as if they were his birthright. I learned early to fade into the background. I wasn't the star of the family story, but I could at least keep the peace by not asking for too much space. I became the supportive older sister, the one who clapped the loudest, smiled the widest, and quietly tucked her own victories into drawers no one ever opened. The day Ethan's acceptance letter to the United States Naval Academy arrived was the day the divide became permanent. The air in our house buzzed with a level of excitement I had never seen. My father, Captain David Hayes, a man known for his stone-faced discipline, threw a barbecue so large it felt like a block party. There were burgers sizzling on the grill, coolers packed with ice and beer, neighbors and officers milling about like it was the 4th of July. That was the day Ethan became the heir. I remember watching my father beam with pride, his arm draped around Ethan's shoulders as he introduced him over and over again. "This is my son, the future admiral." His voice boomed with a joy I had never heard directed at me. I stood on the edge of the crowd, smiling, clapping, playing my part. I had perfected the performance of the proud sister, even as I felt the sharp sting of erasure settle in my chest. That very same week, I had my own milestone. I had just won first place at the National Science Fair for a cryptographic algorithm I had spent months perfecting. It was a prestigious honor, one that earned me a gold-plated medal and the attention of some of the best minds in the country. I remember holding that medal in my palm, feeling the cool weight of it, daring to think, maybe this will be enough. Maybe this will finally make him see me. I found my father in the den, his face buried in the Wall Street Journal. I approached him like a child offering a crayon drawing, heart pounding in my chest. "Dad," I said, my voice soft, almost afraid. "I won." He glanced down briefly, his eyes flicking to the inscription on the medal. "Good job, sweetie," he mumbled, barely lifting his gaze from the newspaper. And that was it. No celebration. No barbecue. No second glance. He handed the medal back to me and immediately shifted the conversation. "Ethan's going to need to double his physical training this summer if he wants to excel at the academy." Just like that, I vanished from the conversation. I vanished from the moment. I vanished from him. That night, in the quiet of my room, I opened the old wooden box where I kept childhood trinkets, forgotten birthday cards, seashells from family vacations, a silver dollar from my grandfather. I placed the medal inside, tucked away, like it had never happened. It became a secret I carried, a memory that whispered to me in the silence. In this family, your victories are invisible. As the years passed, I built a life out of sight, out of mind. I pursued naval intelligence, not because it was safer, not because I wanted to hide, but because it fascinated me. Strategy, information warfare, the unseen battles that shaped the outcomes of wars, those were my battlefields. When I gathered the courage to tell my family I had been accepted into the Naval Intelligence Program, I naively thought they might be proud. I thought they might finally see that I was following a path of service, too. Instead, my father muted the TV and stared at me like I had just told him I'd failed him. His silence was a wall, cold and unmovable. "Intelligence," he finally said, the word rolling off his tongue like a bitter pill. "That's support work. It's for people who can't handle combat. Hayes men aren't support staff. Hayes men." His words landed like a fist in my stomach, not just because he dismissed my career choice, but because he said it so plainly, Hayes men. As if the women in the family didn't count. As if our service was inherently lesser, destined to be footnotes to the real legacy. My mother tried to soften the blow. "Perhaps it's safer for her that way," she offered with a forced smile, but her words were another quiet cut. Safer. As if I was too fragile to face the real dangers, too weak to carry the family name with the same weight as my father and brother. They didn't see my work as a strategy. They didn't see it as warfare. They saw it as a retreat, a concession. They saw me as the quiet failure who had chosen comfort over courage. I let them think that. I let them believe I spent my days pushing papers in a beige cubicle, battling printer jams, filing meaningless reports. But the irony was as cruel as it was perfect. My office wasn't a cubicle. It was the tank. A windowless, soundproof chamber buried deep underground, where the only sound was the constant hum of encrypted servers and the only light came from the glowing screens of live military intelligence. I didn't just push papers. I moved fleets. I directed SEAL teams. I coordinated hostage rescues. I tracked terror cells across continents. But they didn't know that. They never asked. I realized, painfully, that they didn't want to know. Knowing would mean re-evaluating the entire story they had told themselves about who I was, and they were not interested in rewriting their narrative. Their indifference became my fuel. Every late night, every life-or-death decision, every mission that required my absolute focus, it all built a quiet, relentless determination inside me. And still, they thought I played with spreadsheets. Still, they thought I was a side character in their story. But I was never a side character. I was the architect of missions they couldn't even pronounce. I was the ghost in the system, the strategist in the shadows. I wasn't the forgotten daughter. I was the one writing the play they had been performing. They just didn't know it yet. But they would. They would learn. Soon. My family thought I spent my days in a quiet, climate-controlled office, shuffling papers, sipping coffee, and battling the occasional paper jam. They imagined me in a gray cubicle, handling spreadsheets that no one would ever read, buried somewhere deep in the bureaucratic maze of the Pentagon. In a way, they were right about sterility. But they had no idea what that sterility actually contained. They never asked about my work. They never wanted to know. In their world, intelligence was a lesser path, a fallback for people who couldn't survive on the front lines. They thought I lived a life of safety. But my life had always been perched on the razor's edge of risk. My battlefield wasn't on the open seas or in the sky. Mine was buried deep beneath the earth, in a facility so secure, even its nickname was classified. We called it the tank. The tank was a sealed, windowless nerve center, humming with the low, constant pulse of encrypted servers. It was always cold there, recycled air, sterile lighting, walls lined with curved screens glowing with live feeds, satellite images, and layers of cascading intelligence data. There were no coffee breaks. There were no casual conversations. There was only the mission, and the mission never slept. This was my office. This was my war. Most days blurred into nights, a seamless cycle of briefing, monitoring, and coordinating. I lived in the gaps between crises, always bracing for the next red alert, the next chain of decisions that could ripple across continents. One Tuesday bled into Wednesday like so many others, but that particular night carved itself into my memory forever. The tank was unusually tense. Every screen, every headset, every movement in the room was laser-focused on a single unfolding operation, a high-risk hostage rescue in the Red Sea. Pirates had overtaken a civilian oil tanker. 12 innocent lives were hanging by a thread. My team fed me real-time data with a calm precision honed by years of controlled chaos. Their voices came through my earpiece in steady, measured beats, each update sharpening the tactical picture in front of me. My job was to see what others missed. To connect the dots faster than the enemy. To move the pieces on the board before anyone else realized the game had shifted. Viper 1, confirm target location. You are 2 mics out, I relayed into my headset, my voice steady even as my pulse thundered in my veins. On the main screen, the thermal satellite feed showed a small cluster of heat signatures on the deck of the tanker. Pirates. Hostages. The fragile difference between them, mere pixels in the heat map. Eagle eye, enhanced thermal resolution on the bridge. I need a personnel count now. The image sharpened, 7 pirates, 12 hostages, huddled and terrified. This wasn't a spreadsheet. This wasn't theory. This was war. I was commanding a chessboard where the pawns were real people, their lives hinging on the next words out of my mouth. Just as I was about to authorize the breach, my personal phone buzzed in my pocket, a rude, jarring vibration that didn't belong in the life-or-death rhythm of the tank. I ignored it. The buzzing persisted. Protocol was protocol. I glanced at the screen. It was a text from Ethan. Enjoying your weekend in DC? Hit any museums lately? Don't work too hard on those reports, sis. His words lit up the screen. A casual dismissal from a world that had no idea what I was doing at that very moment. I stood on the precipice of a critical military operation, and in his mind, I was just shuffling papers. The nickname SS landed like a final twist of the knife. I clicked off the phone, the screen plunging into darkness, and slid it back into my pocket. Viper 1, stand by, I ordered, my voice cold, razor sharp now. My eyes caught a flicker of movement on a secondary screen, a small fishing boat, unlit, approaching the tanker from the stern. It didn't appear on any maritime charts. It was a ghost. Eagle eye, zoom in. Now. The thermal image sharpened. 6 armed men hidden below deck. It was an ambush. Viper 1, abort. Abort the breach. Secondary hostile force approaching from your 6. They're walking you into a kill box. The relief that washed over me as the SEAL team acknowledged the abort was silent but immense. My call, made in those precious seconds, had just saved their lives. And Ethan? My brother had no idea. He would never know that the boring sister with the paper-pushing job had just prevented his own funeral from being scheduled. Hours later, bone-tired and hollowed out from the adrenaline crash, I returned to my apartment in Washington, D.C. The city lights outside sparkled, indifferent to the life-or-death decisions made in secret bunkers beneath the streets. I poured myself a glass of bourbon, neat. No ice. I stood by the window, staring out at the cityscape, the hum of the tank still ringing faintly in my ears. In my family's story, I was a ghost. An afterthought. But in rooms of consequence, in halls of classified briefings, I was something else entirely. I was the architect of victories that would never make headlines. I was the strategist who had moved entire fleets with the stroke of a pen. I was the hand that tipped the scales in battles my family never even knew were fought. And I had accepted that they would never see it. I had accepted the loneliness of that truth. But sometimes, life offers you a crack in the armor of the ordinary. A rare chance to step out of the shadows and let the light catch the insignia you've earned. That chance came 2 days later. I was summoned to General Miller's office, a place that smelled of leather and black coffee, not bureaucracy. He wasn't a man who wasted time. He wasn't a man who indulged in small talk. You saved 12 lives the other night, he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. And the SEAL team. The president knows. I know. But the official report? Your name won't be there. I had expected that. The Joint Chiefs have agreed to declassify portions of Operation Blackwater, he continued. It's time the Navy starts recognizing the heroes in the shadows. And then came the words that knocked the breath from my lungs. You've been nominated for the Navy Distinguished Service Medal. I stared at him, struggling to process what this meant. For the first time in my life, someone saw me. Not the paper pusher. Not the footnote. Me. You know, he said with a wry smile, your brother's awards ceremony is coming up next month. Wouldn't it be something to recognize 2 of Captain Hayes' children on the same day? The audacity of the idea left me breathless. For years, I had let them believe I was invisible. But perhaps it was time for them to see me. Perhaps it was time for the story to change. The Pentagon had always felt like a maze, a place where power and politics collided in endless corridors, where decisions that changed the world were made in quiet, windowless rooms. For most of my career, I moved through those halls as a ghost. I was known by my call sign, by the operations I led, but not by my name. And for years, I thought that was enough. Until the morning General Miller called me into his office. It was 2 days after the Red Sea operation, 2 days after I had saved the SEAL team without a single member of my family knowing I was even involved. I had come to terms with that, or so I thought. I had accepted that my victories would always be silent, that my name would never be written into the stories my family told. But that morning, something shifted. General Miller's office overlooked the Potomac River, its windows casting soft light across the old wooden desk where stacks of mission briefs and intelligence reports sat in careful piles. There were no family photos on his shelves, no medals displayed on the walls. Just maps. Maps of conflict zones, of trade routes, of the places where the world quietly caught fire while the rest of the country slept. He greeted me with an unusual warmth, a steaming cup of black coffee already in hand, his gruff demeanor softened just enough to feel like something significant was about to happen. "You look exhausted, Sophia," he said, using my first name instead of my rank, a rare break from protocol. I shrugged, my usual armor still firmly in place. "Just another long week, sir." He studied me for a long moment, his sharp eyes missing nothing. "You saved 12 lives the other night. And an entire SEAL team. The official record won't reflect that. But I know. The president knows." His words landed harder than I expected. In my world, recognition was a luxury. Silence was the expectation. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "You should be proud of that." I was, but I didn't know how to hold pride for something I was trained to bury. I didn't know what to say. "I know what you've done," he continued. "Not just last week. Blackwater. The entire operation. The lives you've saved, the crises you've prevented. It's time those victories stopped living in the shadows." I blinked, unsure where he was going. "The Joint Chiefs have agreed," he said. "Parts of Blackwater can now be declassified. Not all of it, but enough." My heart stopped. Operation Blackwater had been my life's work, a 5-year intelligence campaign that had dismantled a global terror financing network and quietly prevented 2 regional wars. It had been buried under layers of the highest security clearances, untouchable, unmentionable. Until now. He smiled faintly, sensing the magnitude of what he was telling me. "You've been nominated for the Navy Distinguished Service Medal." The air seemed to vanish from the room. The Distinguished Service Medal wasn't just an award, it was a recognition reserved for senior officers who had displayed exceptional service and responsibility. It was the kind of honor that rewrote legacies. And then he said something I would never forget. "Your brother's awards ceremony is next month, isn't it?" I nodded, confused. "Wouldn't it be fitting," he said, leaning back in his chair, "if we recognized both of Captain Hayes' children on the same day? For 2 very different, but equally critical contributions to this country." His words sent a wave of electricity through me. For years, I had allowed my family's version of me to stand unchallenged. I had let them believe I was the afterthought, the desk jockey, the forgotten daughter. But now, the truth had a chance to step into the light. Not through confrontation. Not through arguments. But through undeniable, official recognition. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to imagine it, the look on my father's face, the crack in Ethan's smug facade, the quiet shock on my mother's lips. And yet, almost as quickly, the weight of memory pulled me back. I thought of the last 4th of July, a day so picture-perfect it could have been a postcard, our father's sprawling suburban backyard, the scent of burgers on the grill, the American flag fluttering from the porch. Ethan had held court, surrounded by family and neighbors, regaling them with stories from his latest deployment. I had read the classified reports. I knew the truth. His version was embellished, dramatic, polished for the audience. But no one questioned him. They beamed with pride, their unwavering belief in his heroism unshaken. Later that day, my mother had cornered me in the kitchen. She made a pointed comment about a friend's successful, newly single son, an orthopedic surgeon she thought I should meet. "A career is wonderful, Sophia," she had said with a sweet, practiced smile. "But don't forget to focus on what really matters." She didn't mean service. She didn't mean anything. She meant marriage. That was the role she still hoped I would play. Even Ethan, beer in hand, had delivered his annual jab in front of everyone. "When are you going to transfer to a real position, sis? Must be boring sitting at the Pentagon pushing papers all day." It wasn't a question. It was a public verdict, a verdict he never expected to be overturned. I smiled through it, as I always did, but something shifted inside me that day. The ice that had long protected me began to harden into something else, a fortress. And yet, despite it all, a part of me still wanted them to see me. Truly see me. General Miller's proposal wasn't just an opportunity. It was a door I hadn't realized was still waiting to be opened. "It's your call, Admiral," he said, watching me carefully. But I think it's time the story changed. I considered it carefully, the weight of years pressing against the fragile seed of hope that had just been planted. The old Sophia would have hesitated. The new Sophia? She was ready. I looked him in the eye and nodded. "Let's do it." The morning of my brother's awards ceremony arrived wrapped in the familiar sting of anticipation and dread. I had rehearsed the scene in my head 1,000 times, how I would stand quietly, how I would applaud politely, how I would watch my family celebrate Ethan as if he were the only one who ever mattered. But this time would be different. This time, I wouldn't be the footnote. I wore my beige trench coat carefully, a familiar layer of armor concealing the truth beneath it. My family would expect the same Sophia, the invisible sister, the paper pusher. They wouldn't see me coming. When I arrived at the gate of the United States Naval Academy, the same young petty officer from before stopped me again. His professional courtesy was tinged with a familiar discomfort. He glanced at the guest list on his tablet and then back at me. "Ma'am, I don't have Sophia Hayes listed for Lieutenant Ethan Hayes." It was a scene I had already played out weeks earlier. Except this time, I wasn't standing there powerless. Before I could respond, the quiet rumble of an approaching government-issued black sedan interrupted the moment. The car pulled to a smooth stop beside us, and when the door opened, General Miller stepped out, his 4 stars gleaming on his shoulders, his presence commanding the space like a tidal wave. He didn't glance at the guard. He didn't even acknowledge my family, who were watching the scene unfold from a distance. His focus was entirely on me. "There you are, Admiral Hayes," he called, his voice warm and steady, carrying just enough volume to draw the attention of everyone nearby. We were about to send out a search party. Admiral Hayes. The words hit the air like a thunderclap. The petty officer's face went from confusion to horror in a matter of seconds. He realized he had nearly denied entry to a flag officer. His posture snapped into a salute so sharp it was a miracle he didn't injure himself. "Admiral my deepest apologies," he stammered, his voice cracking as he scrambled to open the gate with panicked urgency. "It's quite all right, petty officer," I said, my tone calm but firm. General Miller approached me with a protective hand on my elbow. He leaned in, his voice low enough for only me to hear. "Are you all right, Sophia? Do I need to have a word with them?" My gaze drifted past him, to my parents and to Ethan. Their faces were frozen in slack-jawed disbelief. They had no script for this. No prepared performance. No carefully crafted lines to cover this seismic shift. The part of me that once screamed for their recognition wanted to say yes, to unleash the storm. But that part of me had long since died. I gave a subtle shake of my head. "That won't be necessary, General," I said coolly. "I think they'll figure it out today." His nod was filled with respect, not just for my rank, but for the decision I had made to let silence speak louder than confrontation. He guided me through the gate, walking me past my family without so much as a glance in their direction. I kept my eyes forward, my chin high, my focus locked on the flag, the podium, the future that I had claimed for myself. But I felt their stares, heavy and burning. As we passed, I heard my father's voice, low, stunned, a single word that seemed to crumble under its own weight. "Admiral." It wasn't a greeting. It was a question. An impossible truth he was trying, and failing, to process. Every slight, every dismissal, every moment of being told I wasn't enough came rushing back in that single whispered word. It wasn't bitterness that settled in me. It wasn't anger. It was something far more powerful. It was closure. General Miller led me to the VIP section, where senior officers, generals, and admirals recognized me immediately. They shook my hand, congratulated me on the declassification of Blackwater, and spoke to me as a peer, not as someone's sister, not as someone's daughter, but as Admiral Hayes. The weight of their respect fortified me in ways my family's approval never could. I sat at the front, composed and calm, as the ceremony began. The Master of Ceremonies took the stage and announced the presentation of the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal to Lieutenant Ethan Hayes. I watched as my brother rose, his movements confident, his smile polished. He delivered his acceptance speech flawlessly, thanking his commanding officers, his family, and his wife. When he scanned the crowd, his gaze swept directly over me as if I were a stranger. As if I didn't exist. He never mentioned my name. It was his final attempt to erase me, to maintain the story he had spent years building. But it was too late. General Miller stepped to the podium, and the atmosphere shifted immediately. A four-star general deviating from the program was rare. The silence that fell over the crowd was thick with curiosity. "We have a special unscheduled addition to today's ceremony," he began. A recognition that, due to national security, could not be made public until this very moment. He spoke of heroes we rarely see, those who work in the shadows, whose victories are measured not in territory gained, but in lives saved and tragedies prevented. He spoke of Operation Blackwater. I watched as my father leaned toward Ethan, whispering, "What the hell is Blackwater?" The answer arrived a moment later when General Miller turned to the crowd and announced my name. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my profound honor to welcome to the stage Rear Admiral Sophia Hayes." For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then the room erupted, not in chaos, but in a synchronized, instinctive response. Every uniformed person in that auditorium, from the youngest ensign to the highest-ranking generals, rose to their feet as one. They didn't stand for me because I was someone's daughter. They didn't stand because I was Ethan's sister. They stood because I was Admiral Hayes. Everyone rose. Except for three people. My father. My mother. My brother. They remained seated, frozen in their disbelief, marooned in their private island of shock. I walked to the stage, each step steady, each breath purposeful. General Miller pinned the Distinguished Service Medal to my uniform and leaned in. "Time to tell your story, Admiral," he whispered. He didn't just read the citation. He told the story of the youngest Rear Admiral in modern naval history, of a strategist who had quietly reshaped battles from the deepest corners of the intelligence world. And then he delivered the final, devastating truth. It had been my unit's intelligence that had saved a U.S. destroyer from a catastrophic ambush in the Persian Gulf. Ethan's ship. The reality detonated across my family's faces. My father looked physically struck. My mother's hand trembled against her lips. Ethan's face was drained of all color. He knew. He knew I had saved him. And I never needed to say a word. The ceremony had ended, but the aftershock was only beginning. In the grand reception hall, the soft clinking of champagne glasses and the hum of congratulatory conversations filled the air. Senior officers, members of Congress, and Pentagon officials surrounded me, offering handshakes and words of genuine admiration. I was no longer a shadow. I was the center of gravity. And yet, out of the corner of my eye, I saw them. My family. They moved toward me in a tight, guarded formation, a wounded animal navigating through a crowd it no longer understood. Ethan led the way, his face hardened, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles trembling beneath his skin. My father followed, his expression unreadable, the weight of decades suddenly pressing on his shoulders. My mother trailed behind them, clutching my father's arm like it was the only thing keeping her upright. The congressmen who had been speaking to me politely excused themselves as the temperature around us noticeably dropped. Ethan didn't wait for them to leave. Rear Admiral Hayes, he said, spitting the title like it burned his tongue. His voice was low, tight, and sharp. Quite a performance. I met his gaze calmly. I didn't flinch. His words weren't about the ceremony. They weren't about me. They were about his crumbling illusion. You lied to us, he hissed, his voice rising enough to draw a few curious glances from nearby officers. You lied to all of us for 15 years. You let us believe you were nothing. His anger wasn't righteous. It wasn't protective. It was desperate. His pedestal had been kicked out from under him, and he was scrambling to rebuild it. Across the room, I caught General Miller's eye. He gave a subtle nod to his aide, who immediately appeared at my side. Admiral, the young officer said smoothly, his voice calm, deliberate, we've prepared a private conference room for you. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable continuing this conversation there. Without waiting for a response, he gestured for us to follow. I walked in silence, feeling the weight of my family's steps behind me. The hallway stretched endlessly, each footfall echoing like a drumbeat of something inevitable. When we entered the soundproofed room, the aide closed the door behind us, sealing us away from the polite applause and polished silverware of the reception. And then the explosion came. Why? Ethan's voice cracked with the force of the question. He paced like a caged animal, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. Why would you do this to us? You let me lecture you about sacrifice. About service. You were laughing at me the whole time, weren't you? I said nothing. You humiliated me, he snarled. In front of the entire Navy. In front of Dad. There it was, the real wound. It wasn't about the truth. It wasn't about family. It was about him. I was on the front lines, he barked, jabbing a finger into his own chest. Dad was on the front lines. We served. And you? You sat in an air-conditioned room playing war games on a computer, and you got a medal bigger than both of ours combined? He laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. It's a joke, he spat. It's insulting. His rage crashed over me like a violent storm, but it broke against something solid and immovable. I was no longer the sister desperate for approval. I had become something else. I walked over to the table, poured a glass of water from the pitcher, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I waited until the silence settled thick between us, until the weight of his own words dragged him down. Then I finally spoke. I was never laughing at you, Ethan, I said, my voice quiet, steady, as cold and still as a calm sea. I was doing my job. A job that demanded absolute secrecy. I turned to my father, who, for the first time in my life, met my gaze directly. Did you ever ask me what my job actually was, Dad? I asked, my voice still composed. Or did you just assume it was meaningless because it didn't involve carrying a weapon? His mouth opened slightly, but no answer came. I turned to my mother, who was now quietly sobbing into a delicate handkerchief. Did you ever ask me if I was happy, Mom? Or did you only ask me when I planned to get married? The silence in the room thickened. I looked at them all, my family, my lifelong jury. I didn't lie to you, I said, my voice like glass, transparent, sharp, and impossible to ignore. I simply stopped trying to explain myself to people who had already decided they weren't going to listen. The words hung in the air like a final verdict. My father, the indomitable Captain David Hayes, looked older than I had ever seen him. His shoulders sagged, his head bowed, as if the realization had finally cracked something inside him. And then, the sharp, insistent ring of my encrypted satellite phone shattered the silence. Duty. I glanced at the screen, then back at the people who had spent their lives misunderstanding me. I have to take this, I said, my voice crisp, professional. It's a call I can't miss. I turned to leave, my hand resting briefly on the door handle. My back was to them, but I offered one final truth. I love you, I said, the words foreign but necessary. But I will not be dismissed by you ever again. If we are going to have a relationship from this day forward, it will start with respect. Real respect. I let the silence weigh on them for a heartbeat longer. Think about it. And then I walked out, leaving them alone in the echoing aftermath of the truth. 6 months passed. 6 months of careful, awkward steps across newly drawn lines. 6 months of hesitant phone calls, of invitations that no longer assumed I was unavailable. 6 months of tentative, fragile change. One quiet Sunday afternoon, I visited my parents' house. Something was different. Against the far wall of the living room stood a new glass display case, beautifully crafted from dark cherry wood. My father was there, polishing the glass carefully, his own medals arranged neatly on the lower shelves. But at the center, at eye level, was my Distinguished Service Medal. Beside it sat a framed photograph, me on the stage at Annapolis, General Miller pinning the medal to my uniform. My mother walked in from the kitchen, her smile small but real. "Your father built that last month," she said softly. "He said it was time the Hayes family's story told the whole truth. Not the story of the men. Not the story of combat versus intelligence. Just service." The silence after I walked out of that conference room became the dividing line of my life, the moment the old dynamics collapsed, and the terms changed forever. For most of my life, I had let my family define me. I let their expectations set the stage, I let their dismissals write my role, and I convinced myself that their approval was the final measure of my worth. But standing there, in that small, soundproof room where my brother's rage had crashed and broken like a wave against a stone, I understood something with crystal clarity. Respect is not something you beg for. Respect is something you require. I left them with a choice. If we were going to continue as a family, it would no longer be on their terms. It would no longer come with the silent acceptance of condescension. There would be no more lectures, no more public dismissals, no more quiet erasures. From that day forward, our relationship would only exist if it was built on mutual respect. That was my condition. Non-negotiable. Final. I didn't return their calls immediately. I didn't rush to repair what had broken. I gave them time to think, to wrestle with the uncomfortable weight of the truth they had refused to see for years. And surprisingly, they used it. The first message came from my mother, her voice soft, almost uncertain. "I've been reading about your field," she said, leaving a voicemail I played twice. "I never realized how complex it is. I'm proud of you, Sophia. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't everything. But it was a start." Ethan took longer. His pride had built a fortress so high that even the truth struggled to scale it. But slowly, the cracks formed. Tentative text messages. Quiet questions. A shared article about naval intelligence, sent without comment but loaded with meaning. 6 months passed. 6 months where the air between us was no longer sharp with rivalry or cold with dismissal, but simply different. Uncharted. Fragile. And then, one Sunday afternoon, I walked into my parents' home and saw what I never thought I would see. In the living room, against the far wall, was a new display case. My father, Captain David Hayes, the man who had once dismissed my career with a glance, had built it himself. It was a beautiful cabinet, dark cherry wood polished to a gleaming shine. His medals were there, arranged with reverence. My grandfather's were there, carefully placed on the lower shelves. But at the center, at perfect eye level, was mine. The Navy Distinguished Service Medal. Next to it, a framed photograph of me at the ceremony, General Miller pinning the medal to my uniform. My mother appeared at my side, her hands dusted with flour from baking. She followed my gaze to the display. "He built it last month," she said softly. "He said it was time the family story told the whole truth. Not just the story of the men. Not just the story of battles. But the story of all the ways we serve." Her words landed like a slow, gentle tide, reshaping the shoreline of my memory. At dinner that evening, the change was almost imperceptible, but it was there, a subtle shifting of the gravity in the room. There were no exaggerated war stories. No pointed jabs about desk jobs. The weight that had once pressed against every family meal had lifted, even if only slightly. My father asked about my work, not out of obligation, but out of real curiosity. "Sophia," he began, his voice hesitant, as if trying out the shape of my name for the first time in years. "With that many high-level officers and civilians at the Pentagon, personnel management must be complex. How do you handle politics?" It wasn't a test. It wasn't a setup. It was a question. One he genuinely wanted me to answer. And Ethan, my brother who had once dismissed me in front of friends and family, spoke of a new risk assessment protocol he was implementing on his ship. "It's funny," he said, his voice softer, almost sheepish, his gaze flickering toward me but never quite landing. "Some of the principles. I feel like I've learned them from somewhere." It wasn't an apology, not exactly. But it was the closest thing to one he had ever managed. And then my mother, with a rare steadiness in her voice, raised her wine glass. "A toast," she said, her eyes warm, her gaze sweeping across the table. "To the strength and intelligence of all the Hayes children. In all their forms." The glasses clinked gently. No grand gestures. No staged performances. Just a small, honest moment of acknowledgement. After dinner, Ethan and I found ourselves on the old wooden swing on the back porch, a place where we had spent countless summer evenings as kids. The silence between us was comfortable, no longer charged with competition or unspoken resentment. He was the one who finally broke it. "I'm sorry, Sophia," he said, staring out at the darkening tree line. "The way I treated you. The things I said about your work. It was never really about you." His voice wavered, the admission unspooling from somewhere deep. "I needed to be the hero," he confessed, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the words. "I needed to feel like I was living up to Dad's expectations. To the family name. I was so insecure. I couldn't stand that you had found your own way. A way I didn't understand." It wasn't easy for him to say. It wasn't easy for me to hear. But it was real. And real was what I had asked for all along. "Thank you for saying that," I said, a genuine smile finding its way to my lips. "For a long time, I thought I needed this family's approval to feel whole. I thought my value was something you all had to give me." I placed a hand over my heart. But those years of being overlooked, they taught me something more important. My worth isn't determined by anyone else. It's right here. It always was. His gaze met mine, steady and open. "I'm proud to be your brother, Sophia," he said quietly. And for the first time in my life, I could finally say it, and mean it, with every fiber of my being. "I'm proud to be your sister." The peace I felt in that moment wasn't about winning. It wasn't about being seen. It was about acceptance, finally, beautifully, fully earned. 6 months passed. 6 months where the fabric of our family slowly, carefully, began to stitch itself into something new. The change didn't come with sweeping declarations or grand apologies. It arrived in the smallest, quietest ways, in tentative questions, in carefully chosen words, in the soft reshaping of long-held patterns. The ultimatum I had given them that day, the simple, unshakable demand for respect, wasn't the end of our story. It was the beginning of something else. A slow, fragile rebuilding. I had expected them to retreat into their silence. To fortify the walls they had lived behind for decades. But instead, they surprised me. I saw it first with my father. He didn't call often, but when he did, his questions were different now. They weren't surface-level inquiries. They weren't veiled attempts to steer me toward the life he had once expected me to chase. One afternoon, his voice had sounded almost cautious as he asked, How do you manage the strategic alignment across so many interagency teams? I can't imagine balancing that many operational layers. It wasn't a test. It was curiosity. It was respect. My mother changed in smaller, but no less significant ways. She no longer asked when I planned to settle down. She didn't mention the sons of family friends, didn't steer our conversations toward her carefully curated list of eligible men. Instead, she began asking about my team. How are the people who work under you, she'd say softly. You must have a lot of responsibility for them. She started to see me not as someone waiting for a husband to complete her life, but as someone already whole, already leading, already carrying something heavy and important. The distance that had once seemed insurmountable between us began to shrink. Ethan changed, too, though his change came in fragments. It wasn't immediate. His pride was a fortress that had taken years to build, and he couldn't bring it down in a day. But cracks formed, and light slipped through. He began forwarding me articles, pieces about cybersecurity, about intelligence coordination, about the intersection of battlefield strategy and information dominance. He sent them without comment, but the message was there. I see your world now. One day, I found a message from him that simply said, I used one of your decision matrix structures with my junior officers. It worked. No fanfare. No long explanations. But in that sentence, I heard it, the smallest echo of acknowledgement. When I visited their house 6 months later, I found the symbol of everything that had shifted waiting for me in the living room. It was the glass display case my father had built by hand. Inside, the medals that once told only one version of the Hayes family story had been rearranged. My grandfather's service medals were there. My father's Navy commendations were there. But in the center, front and elevated, was my Navy Distinguished Service Medal. Next to it, a photo, me on the stage at Annapolis, General Miller pinning the medal to my uniform. It was positioned as the heart of the display. My father, polishing the glass when I arrived, didn't rush to explain it. He didn't offer a carefully prepared speech. He just wiped the surface with quiet precision, then finally said, it was time the story told the whole truth. It wasn't about the men anymore. It wasn't about front lines versus intelligence rooms. It was about service, in all its forms. That evening at dinner, there was no careful performance. No competitive posturing. No exclusion. The conversations were open, easy, and human. My father asked about the complexity of managing so many layers of civilian and military personnel in the Pentagon. It wasn't small talk, it was a real question, asked with a genuine desire to understand. Ethan shared how his risk management protocols had evolved. It's funny, he said, glancing toward me briefly. Some of the structures, I feel like I've seen them before. It was a quiet olive branch, a way of admitting that what I did mattered, even if he still couldn't quite say the words. My mother raised her wine glass in a soft but steady toast. To the Hayes children, she said, her gaze sweeping across the table. All of them. In all their forms. In all their strength. There was no correction this time. No footnote. No hidden message about who counted and who didn't. We clinked glasses, not with the awkward tension of past family dinners, but with something fragile and new, something that felt like peace. After dinner, Ethan and I found ourselves on the porch swing, the same one we used to sit on as kids on hot summer nights. We sat there in the dark, the rhythmic creak of the swing filling the quiet. He was the one who broke the silence. I was angry because I thought I needed to be the hero, he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the yard. I thought being the hero was the only way Dad would see me. The only way any of you would. His voice cracked slightly. And then I realized, you didn't need to be the hero. You just were. You didn't need the stage. You didn't need the stories. He laughed softly, almost to himself. You were always the hero, Sophia. I just didn't know how to see you. For years, I had chased something that now felt oddly unimportant. Their recognition, their approval, it had once felt like the missing piece of me. But sitting there, listening to my brother's quiet admission, I realized that what I had needed all along wasn't their permission to exist. It was their understanding that I had existed fully, whether they saw me or not. "I'm proud to be your brother," he said, his voice steady now. "And I'm proud to be your sister," I answered. This time, I meant it in every fiber of my being. The Hayes family wasn't perfect. The cracks still existed. Some silences would never fully be filled. But the story had changed. The stage had shifted. And for the first time, the story finally had room for all of us. Looking back now, I realize that my story was never about revenge. It was never about proving anyone wrong or standing at the top simply to say, "I told you so." It was about something far quieter. Far harder. It was about finding peace within myself. About learning to stand tall without waiting for someone else to tell me I was allowed to. There's a particular kind of pain that comes from being unseen by the people who are supposed to know you best. It's not a sharp wound, it's a slow ache, the kind that settles deep into your bones over years. The kind that whispers to you that maybe you are as small as they say you are. That maybe you don't matter as much as you think you do. For most of my life, I carried that ache like a second skin. I let their narrative shape me. I let their dismissal sink into my foundation. I became a woman who excelled in the shadows, but who still looked toward the light, hoping, just once, to be invited in. But the truth is, we don't need invitations. We don't need permission to take up space. We don't need anyone's approval to be whole. I built my career in silence, not because I wanted to hide, but because the work required it. The secrecy wasn't a punishment, it was a responsibility. And in the quiet, I found power. I found purpose. I saved lives. I directed missions that turned the tide of battles most people never knew were being fought. I didn't need my family to validate those victories. But what I did need, what I think we all need, was to know that the story I told myself about who I was didn't have to match the story they told about me. For years, I thought the goal was to change them. To make them see me. But somewhere along the way, I realized the real goal was to stop needing them to see me in order to see myself. When I finally stood on that stage, when my name echoed through that hall, it wasn't the applause that mattered. It was the silence. The silence where all the years of being dismissed collapsed into nothing. The silence where I finally understood that their vision of me was never the truth, it was just a story they told because it was easier than confronting what they didn't understand. I think we all face that moment, in some form. The moment where we realize that chasing validation is a race that never ends. That the peace we're looking for doesn't live in anyone else's hands. It lives in ours. For me, that moment happened in front of a sea of uniforms, a medal heavy on my chest, and the people who once overlooked me sitting in stunned silence. For you, it might look entirely different. It might be walking away from a job where you were never seen. It might be choosing yourself after years of shrinking to fit someone else's expectations. It might be sitting in your own living room, realizing that you've already built a life that is enough, whether anyone claps for you or not. The details are different, but the truth is the same. We do not exist to be measured by anyone else's scale. We do not exist to beg for a seat at tables we are fully qualified to build ourselves. I walked away from that stage not with vengeance, but with freedom. The freedom to tell my story on my own terms. The freedom to require respect as the bare minimum, not as a prize I had to earn. The freedom to love my family, but to also understand that loving them didn't mean surrendering who I was. And as the months passed, as the quiet shifts took root in our family, I realized something even more powerful. The confrontation wasn't a victory. The confrontation was simply the door. The real victory was what came after. The gentle reshaping. The unexpected phone calls. The quiet acknowledgments. The moments where my father's carefully guarded questions cracked open the distance between us. The times Ethan reached out, not to prove something, but to share something. The dinner table that no longer belonged to a hierarchy, but to a family. Those were the moments that mattered. Because they weren't loud. They weren't public. They were real. And real was what I had been chasing all along. For anyone who has ever stood in the shadows of their own story, I hope you know this. You don't need to wait for someone else to see you before you start seeing yourself. You don't need to wait for the world to hand you a moment. You can claim your moment. You can build your own stage. And when you do, you might be surprised at who eventually chooses to join you there. Or maybe you won't need them to. Maybe you'll realize you've already arrived exactly where you were meant to be. That is the quiet revolution of self-respect. It doesn't roar. It doesn't beg. It simply stands. And that is enough. My story is not just about medals or military ranks or shattered family hierarchies. It's about the power of stepping into your own worth. It's about the choice to walk through the door of your own making and never again ask for permission to belong. If you've ever felt like you've had to fight for your seat, if you've ever been told you were less, if you've ever shrunk yourself to make someone else comfortable, this story is for you. It's not about becoming the loudest voice in the room. It's about knowing you don't have to be. It's about the quiet, steady certainty that you matter. You always have. And you always will. Life teaches us, often in the quietest and most painful ways, that true self-worth does not come from external validation. It is something we must recognize and honor within ourselves. Sophia's story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the people closest to us may fail to see our value, not because it isn't there, but because their perception is limited by their own expectations. We cannot control how others see us, but we can choose how we see ourselves. We can choose to live fully, lead confidently, and stand firm in our own truth, even when it's unacknowledged. For many of us, especially as we grow older, we realize that peace comes not from convincing others, but from quietly knowing who we are. Relationships can heal, but only when built on mutual respect. When we finally stop chasing approval and start embracing our own journey, we open the door to genuine connection and freedom. Sophia's journey invites us to reflect: where have we allowed someone else's limited view to define our story? And how can we begin rewriting that narrative today? If her story resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments. We would love to hear your experiences. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire and uplift. Your voice matters here, and by subscribing, sharing, and commenting, you help us continue bringing stories that honor every life journey. Together, we can create a space where every story finds its rightful place.